Hey, everybody. Welcome to Retro Repair Roundup. I am one of your hosts. I am Ron, and I wanted to say thank you to everybody that took a few minutes to join us here this evening. I think we've got a really great interview with Aaron. He's going to talk to us about all the trouble with coding on vintage computers and such. I did want to go ahead and make sure that we acknowledge that Joe and Trina aren't here this evening. Joe has just been covered over with work. Trina hasn't been feeling all that well, so we're doing what we can. So we have a special extra guest tonight. Steve from Mac84 has agreed to sit in and ask a few questions because this is a topic that interests him as well. So how about we go through and we'll just greet some folks in chat, and then we'll get right to our interview with Aaron. So I want to say hello to Jeremy's Vintage Hillbilly Shack, Mark, Dave from Dave's Vintage Apple Tech, Mac84, you're in chat as well. Thanks for the view. Curtis Boyle is here. Let's see. Ryan from Everything is Broken Garage. Ian Scott is here. 2K Compliant, CDI. Bill is here. Hey, Joe's here in the chat. Joe is here in spirit, of course. Henry Noons is here. And I am sure, Jack 68K, and I'm sure other people will filter in as we get going this evening. So, but let's get right to it. Aaron Giles is a developer. He's famous for porting a lot of LucasArts titles from the PC over to the Mac and writing the classic and indispensable Macintosh utility JPEG view. Aaron, how are you this evening?
I'm doing good. Thank you.
Cool.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to just take a minute or so and tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm sort of a self-taught computer programmer. I came up through being a Mac programmer after college and spent about a decade doing Mac programming from shareware to games and stuff in between. And then I moved on to Windows stuff, and since then I've been working a lot on emulation-related topics, and also I ended up working at Microsoft, the great evil, if you were the Macintosh person back in the day. But I spent almost 20 years there, and now I'm sort of semi-retired from that aspect.
Very cool. Steve, do you want to get us rolling here?
Yes, if I can find the mute button. So, Aaron, what type of games were you interested in playing when you were in your youth? Did you have a particular genre you enjoyed playing? Were you an arcade kid or a console kid? Just sort of fill in the blanks of maybe your interest that got you started in this whole thing.
Yeah, I was totally an arcade kid. I mean, I grew up in the era of the classic arcades, and near my home there were little In-N-Out marts and stuff, and each of them would have a couple of cabinets, and they rotated through them pretty frequently. And so, my style of game growing up was definitely the arcade. I did have as a kid, I had a PC, actually a PC Junior, and got to play, early PC games like I really liked Sublogic, Night Mission Pinball. I liked all the early Electronic Arts games like Seven Cities of Gold and those kind of games. So yeah, that was kind of what I grew up on. And I did consoles a little bit. Like my friends all had Ataris and ColecoVisions, but I had a Mattel Intellivision, so that was our home console. I always seemed to have like the weird. My computers and selections were always the strange ones. So like my friends had Ataris, I had Intellivision. My friends had Apples and Commodores, and I had at first a Heathkit CPM machine because my dad was like a mainframe computer guy and he thought he could use it to connect to his work and stuff like that. And then I got the PC, but not an IBM PC. I got a PC Junior, so that was kind of the odd thing. I went to college and I had a word processor. I actually did not actually bring a computer with me to college. I had a dedicated word processor, an old Smith Corona daisy wheel clunker. At college, everything was Mac. And so that's kind of how I got into Mac, was to get into college and open my eyes to the world of Mac. I'd, of course, seen the early Macs, Macs were introduced in 84. I went to college in 89. So, I knew of Macs, but I never really had any hands-on because they were way too expensive for my family to afford. So when I got to college, I saw these Macs, and they're not just the basic Macs, but at the time the early color Macs were showing up, and you get 256 colors at 640 by 480, and that was just mind-bogglingly beautiful graphics to a person like that, even compared to VGA and other stuff that the PC guys were having at the time.
Yeah, that's really cool that you got to experience some of the higher end computers, because a lot of us, our schools had, the hand-me-downs of hand-me-downs, or
Yeah, certainly in grade and high school, it was the hand-me-downs. It was all Apple IIs. I did get to play on an Amiga when I was in high school. For some reason, our computer folks at the high school got into Amigas. They were going to use them for desktop publishing in the early days. And so I got to take my AP Computer Science class on an Amiga. And the problem was AP Computer Science taught you Pascal. Well, I already knew Pascal back to front. I was like, you're not going to teach me anything in this class. I'm going to, you just basically need to keep me busy so that I can take the AP exam at the end of the year. And so basically they just let me sit on the Amiga, and I wrote a couple of video games in Modulo 2, which is basically Pascal++ on the Amiga. And so that I got a chance to play around on the Amiga a little bit back in the day.
That's awesome.
Wow.
Yeah, it's good that you got experience with a bunch of different machines, because sometimes you grow up with just one, and then that's sort of what you put all your time and your energy in, and that if that's not a winning platform, it's like you got to start over from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely having experience with all those platforms made it a lot easier when I got into emulation. And a lot of emulation is tackling platforms from the before years, and having experience with a wide variety of them made it pretty easy to jump into even architectures I wasn't familiar with. I'm sort of like, I kind of know how this goes, even if it's not something I'm directly familiar with. It's sort of like microprocessors tend to work roughly the same. And figuring that stuff out was pretty well advanced by the fact that I'd studied, assembly language back when I was a kid on my Heathkit.
High praise from Ian Scott.
I was just a little boondoggle for Ian. He was having trouble getting his CMS stuff working on his Pico Gus, and I said, I've got a CMS emulator. You can try it and see if it works for you. So he managed to get it working. So I'm happy that he put it on there.
That's awesome.
It is pretty cool. I love it when the community works together on stuff.
Yeah. So that's a good segue for my question. When did you get excited about computer programming, and what were some of the first projects you worked on for personal growth?
So I got excited about computer programming when I was about 9, I would say. I mean, literally, basically, at that point, it was about 1979. Arcade games were starting to show up everywhere, and I knew I wanted to be able to write arcade games. And around 1980, I believe, is when we got our Heathkit. And the sucky thing about that was there was no graphics mode, so it was all text-based. But I got like the classic, basic computer games books, the ones where you type in the programs, and they were all text-based, fortunately, so they ran on any system. And I kind of learned from that. But I quickly said, I know computer games are written in assembly language; they're not written in BASIC. And so I bought an 8080 programmer's manual for Intel 8080 assembly, which is on the Heathkit, was an 8080 chip, and started learning how to hack that. And I actually started writing some basic stuff in assembly language on my Heathkit when I was like, even before high school. And then we got the PC Junior, and I went straight to assembly language for that as well, because that was just that was really where it was at. I knew that was, if I wanted to do games, that was what I was going to have to do. And so I went straight to x86 assembly language there. And, being a cheap teenager, and my family not having a lot of money, so our PC Junior had 128K. So I bought the Microsoft Macro Assembler. I actually forked over like $100 for it, which as a kid, that was a lot of money. Yeah. And I bought it and I ran it, and it barely squeezed into the 128K to assemble code. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. It's a freaking assembler. It shouldn't take 128K to compile, something that's really basic. And so online, there was this guy from Intel. He created another assembler that was available online. When I say online, at that time it was BBS. So we had access to modems, 1200 baud modems, and that kind of thing. So I was in the local BBS scene as well, dialing up to those. And I found online there that they had this A86, it was called. It was a assembler written by this guy from Intel, but he was super, like, it was a commercial product. And he did, even though he offered it for free, he said you can't ship your code with it. And the way I generate code is I generate it in a special way that I'll be able to it's basically fingerprinted the code as it generated it. So it took advantage of the fact that on Intel processors, you can encode certain things multiple ways. And so he would fingerprint your code, and that scared the bejesus out of me. I mean, I don't know if he would ever come after some little kid in the thing. This scared me. So I said, well, I'm going to use this for a little while, but I can't ship anything with it and put up on the BBSs, which I wanted to share, the programs I'd written. Right. And so I ended up writing my own assembler in assembly language, using his assembler to bootstrap it. So basically, I wrote the assembler, I compiled it the first time with his, and then once it could self-assemble, I threw his stuff in the trash and pretended like I'd never seen it before. And then all my assembly language that I wrote when I was in high school was all hand done there. And I actually released a couple of games on the PC for shareware back in the day. Nobody sent me any money, and I can't find them on any of the old BBS. Every time a new BBS collection comes up of like, oh yeah, we scraped some old BBSs, maybe please let my programs be there, because I used to have code and everything on floppy disks, and somehow between me going to college and back, those floppy disks disappeared, and I would have loved to have all my old, like I had a version of Risk that you could play against one or more players or against the computer, or the computer can play itself. And it had strategies, and that was all in assembly language. We actually sat down with graph paper and traced out a Risk board, the pixels on the Risk board to create a representation there. And that, and I had another game I called Rescue, which I was actually pretty proud of. I actually always think if I ever write a kind of a quickie, fun game to do like in a browser or on some simple system, I might go back and resurrect that idea of a game called Rescue, where you rescue these people who are being eaten by marauding monsters. It was kind of fun.
Sounds fun.
That's really cool. I always love hearing the stories, especially about when folks are young and they just the links that they go through to have the tools they need or the access to the equipment they need, and it always seems like it's a struggle, but the tumblers line up, and you're able to have to make it. And it's
when you're young,
crazy.
Time is cheaper than money, right? I mean, you got more time than money when you're young, so that's the thing. I mean, my other favorite story that I love to tell is that when we had the PC Junior, my dad bought a Okidata printer, a dot matrix printer, and it was not the cheap one. It was like the expensive one, like a 24-pin print head. And he splurged on this. And the funny thing about it was it actually used a typewriter ribbon. So when you need to replace the ribbon, you actually had two spools. You had to take the spool and you threaded the ribbon through the print head. And one day when doing that, I was replacing the spool and I jammed it in there, and I jammed it too hard and I bent some of the pins on the print head. So everything came out horribly jagged. And I was scared to death. I was like, oh my God, my dad's going to kill me, because I basically destroyed the print head on this super expensive printer he bought. And so I eventually wrote, in DOS, I wrote a program that would intercept all the print commands to print characters and replace it with a font that I designed that accounted for the bentness of the pins, so that it came out looking roughly okay. And so it was a TSR, Terminant State Resident program in DOS. And you basically, he knew that I'd broken it, but because I came up with a software solution to a hardware problem, which has sort of been my mantra since then, it saved my bacon, and I didn't get into too much trouble.
It's like, son, I can't be mad about it, but it's stuff like that makes me think about like Leave It to Beaver. They thought they had broken the window on the car. And so they were like driving around with oh no, I want the window down. It's fine. It's just faking it because I don't want to get in trouble.
Yeah.
But that's hilarious.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, some of those limitations that you had to deal with back in the day, I'm sure were inspiring to you also, because you think of, just as you were saying, you had more time than money when you're young. So fiddling around with things, or just trying to create something and get it to work where you otherwise would not have been able to, especially like you said, memory limitations and so on.
Yeah, I mean, things like that were definitely, there's a hacker mentality that I definitely developed through that kind of thing, because the other problem with the PC Junior was that most PC games would run, but not all of them. And usually the reasons they wouldn't run is copy protection. And the copy protection was usually they were talking directly to the disk controller. And when you read a floppy disk on the PC, you send a command to the disk controller, and then you program the DMA controller to direct memory access to basically bring the bytes over into memory so that you don't have to do it manually. On the PC Junior, they cheaped out and they said, well, we don't need that DMA controller. So basically you issue the command to the floppy disk, and then you sit in a loop and you read the bytes one at a time from the floppy controller. That was all hidden behind the BIOS. So as long as you talk to the BIOS to have it do the reading of the floppy from you, it all worked. But the games, of course, didn't. They needed to do special commands and tweak the floppy controller to do stuff. And so any game that did that didn't work. But of course, if I could figure out how to hack the games to not need that copy protection, I could make the games work. And so there were a couple of times when I bought a game on a risk, thinking, oh my gosh, I want this game, but it didn't run. Rather than take it back or try to get my money back, I would usually just try to hack it until it worked. and managed to do that. So again, necessity is the mother of invention, and that taught me a lot about low-level programming and how you boot off a PC and start up a system. So,
Steve, you should ask your question because it's it's very much related to what we were just saying.
Yeah. So like, I know you're talking about the PC Junior and some other systems you got. So obviously, eventually, you got your hands on, I would assume, your own Macintosh, or you purchased one, or leased one, or so on. So I'm just curious, like the first Mac that you owned, and then if you had like the dream machine at that time, but you couldn't afford. There's always like, oh, I wish I got that one model up.
Yeah, I was waiting for you to steer us toward Macintosh, since that was ostensibly the reason you wanted to talk to me. But I could go on about my early PC days for a long time. But the Mac stuff, So I went to college, and all the Mac labs had Macs, or all the computer labs had Macs in them. They were pretty much exclusively Macs, and they're almost all like Mac SE30s, I believe. But 2 doors down from me in the dorm was this girl that I was kind of sweet on, and she had a Mac 2 CX.
Oh,
Not just a Mac 2 CX, she had a portrait display, which at the time I'd never seen anything like that. I mean, the portrait displays were it was weird to see a vertical shaped monitor. But her dad apparently had some money set aside, and he was going to buy her the top of the line PC. It had like 8 megabytes of RAM, which at the time, and an 80 megabyte hard disk, which was just crazy specs for the time. And so I was definitely fascinated there. But I mean, everybody in the dorm had Macs, or most of the people in the dorm, I would say, had Macs or that kind of thing, because the school kind of pushed you in that direction. And so, the thing about Macs in those days is everybody had their, startup sounds and everything. So there was a certain collection of, samples from like the Terminator and Aliens and stuff that was all being shared amongst everybody to play. And it was just kind of this standard set of sounds. If you ever want that nostalgia, go listen to TGT. They have a song called Machine Gun, which is pretty much the entire set of samples that you'd always hear on all the Macs. It's all Aliens and Terminator samples from the time. But anyway, I got to program on my girlfriend's. Actually, I didn't get to program. I used my girlfriend's 2CX, because at the time when I went to college, I said, I'm a little too in deep in programming as a high school student. I mean, that was really like I'd spend most of my day like downstairs in the basement programming on my computer doing stuff, because like just a fount of ideas. And when I went to college, I'm like, I need to focus on studies. I can't be having a big distraction of programming, which is why I got that word processor I mentioned. I'm like, I can't have a computer in my room even. That'd be a bad idea. So for the first couple of years, that's what I did. I wrote all my papers on that word processor. I occasionally got to play a game or two, on the Macs. They had, usual like games like Shuffle Puck Cafe, I remember, was big back in the day, and Bonk. We used to play Bonk all the time. In fact, my wife still quits. Bonk. They had the great samples. It's basically just a whack-a-mole game that you play all the time. And Glider, of course, and all those great classics. And then my girl, she became my girlfriend, and so when she was a French literature major, and she went to Paris to study abroad for a year in third year, in her junior year. And I said, well, I can babysit your Mac for you while you're gone. So that was a twofold thing, because not only was like my girlfriend gone, so it was the reason I socialized pretty much was gone, but now I had a Mac in my room, and it was a single room on top of it, so I didn't even have a roommate to fight with all the time. And so that was when I decided, hey, I kind of want to learn to program on the Mac a little bit. And so the computer labs had, I think, ThinkC, I believe, is what we used at the time. For some reason, I never really wanted to program in Pascal, even though I'd done Turbo Pascal quite a lot on my PC Junior. So like I was pretty familiar with Pascal, so you'd think I would just go to Pascal, but I kind of thought like C looks cooler. It's more terse, and it appealed to the kind of hacker mentality, I guess. And so I picked up ThinkC through the campus thing. You could, had certain applications that were site licensed, and we could use ThinkC. And I just started hacking a little bit. And about that time, QuickTime 1.0 was released. And QuickTime 1.0 not only played movies, but it also had a bunch of image codecs in there. And JPEGs were kind of becoming a thing that you could download, and just you see them on these beautiful screens that have 640 by 480, 256 colors. Even 24/8 colors or 824 cards were starting to show up, and you could get full 24-bit color. And so I was like, well, that'd be cool if I could write a program to load a JPEG and display it on the screen. So I said, okay, let me do that. That was my exercise to do that, and started hacking on that. And I'm like, okay, well, this is kind of useful. And then I eventually started, adding some spit and polish to it, and said, okay, well, if I let you rescale it, or draw it better, come up with the trick at the time was JPEG is 24-bit color essentially, and so if you're displaying it on 256 color screen, you gotta reduce the color sample down. And there's a lot of research into how to come up with the optimal 256 colors to display a given image. And so I spent time digging into that and learning how to do that. And eventually I was like, hey, this is pretty good. And I can't remember the exact sequence of events about how it happened, but around the time on campus, there's a giant local talk network, or Apple Talk, Local Talk, I can't remember. There's a network that we could access, and it connected to the internet. I mean, we literally had broadband in our dorm rooms, which was pretty awesome. And so we would go on to Gopher and FTP and all that other good stuff. And then NCSA Mosaic came out, and we got a chance to run that, and we're like, wow, that's pretty amazing. But at the time, the early builds, you clicked on an image. There was no inline images. All the images were you clicked on them, and then it opened up in an external program to show it. And I was always hated the fact that when you clicked on a thing and it loaded an image that was bigger than your screen, you had to scroll around to see the stupid thing. Because I'm like, that's not what I want. If I'm looking at an image, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have to figure out how to zoom out or whatever like that. It should just show it, the whole image. And I said that was dumb. So I kind of retooled the work that I was doing on this little JPEG just viewing thing to always do that. I'm like, okay, whenever I load JPEG, it's going to show me the whole image. There's no scrolling. In fact, I didn't even support scrolling. I was like, I'm not even going to support scrolling. I'm just going to scale it to there. And it was an expensive operation to do at the time on 68,000, 68020 machines. But I'm like, hey, I know assembly language. I can make that as fast as I can. And so I learned 68,000 assembly language in order to make that as fast as I could, and made the scaling as fast as I could, and did that. And I think I think people started to realize that, hey, that's actually pretty useful, that when I click on an image in NCSA Mosaic, if I configure my JPEG program to be the thing that opens it instead of GIF converter or whatever they were defaulting to at the time, I can't remember what it was. I said, well, then I always set up my NCSA Mosaic to open with my little JPEG viewer, and eventually I started sharing it around. I'm like, well, I think other people find this useful, and then eventually it became sort of the de facto. I think that became the default configuration. I think it also helped that I wasn't charging anybody anything for it. I never asked for shareware fees or anything like that. The early versions were just free, and then eventually I eventually started asking people to send me a postcard if they liked it, and Wikipedia claims that I am the progenitor of postcardware, though something in the back of my mind makes me think I got the idea from someone else. But until we can identify that person, as I step forward, I guess I'll take the claim as.
I was going to say, just own it. It's
fine. I'll own it for now.
Just own it. Yeah.
We'll send you some postcards after the show.
Yeah.
When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
Exactly. So yeah, I got like 6,000 postcards from people all over the world from doing that, and I actually scanned them all. So the first thing after I semi-retired from Microsoft is I was like, what am I going to do with this giant pile of postcards? I dug them all out. I got a feed scanner. I scanned all 6,000 of them, and I actually have a postcardware.net. You can go check that out, and you can browse my collection of postcards and see that. And I also have bots that post on Mastodon and Blue Sky 3 times a day, just random postcards from my collection. So go follow those, postcardware.
That's cool.
That is very cool.
That was sort of that's how JPEG View got created. And after that, it was just sort of like the way I tend to program is I write something and then I'm like, well, where can I take this? What else can I use this thing I've started with to learn something new? And so like I started learning QuickTime with this JPEG View thing, but then I was like, okay, well, how do I learn how to, optimize color spaces and make that do that? And how do I learn 6820 assembly language? Okay, well, here's an excuse to do that. How do I, learn AppleScript? And I learned how to do AppleScript, so I made it all scriptable and that kind of thing. And so it's sort of, once I get a platform, it becomes the thing I want to use rather than creating a new program. I'll just be like, okay, well, I can tack on to what I've already got, some new feature, and use that as a way to learn. And how do I learn how to write PowerPC code or recompile my program for PowerPC when that came out? Well, that was JPEG View. I just did that first. It turned out I was one of the first shareware programs to actually have a fat binary for that. And of course, all my image manipulation stuff was optimized for PowerPC, which was a good thing to have optimized at the time. So that's just kind of my philosophy when programming. And if you look at stuff that I do on my own, you pretty much see that pattern everywhere I go.
Yeah. Now, for JPEG View, did you distribute it like through a BBS or like what was your method at the time for getting awareness?
Oh, what was it called? There was a site that you could that was common. Like it's just word of mouth. You'd get a note that, oh, this is a site that has like a ton of shareware and freeware programs and games and stuff like that. And so you'd go and you check that site. I'm blanking on what the name of it was though, but
okay.
if you told me, I'd be like, oh yeah, that was it. So you basically upload your stuff there, and then from there it kind of becomes viral. At the time, it was very much everybody was sharing everything that was allowed on these FTP sites, and so you just get some address or some Gopher site. But it was mostly FTP, I think, and it was Wisconsin, I think. One of the universities, I think it was Wisconsin was one of them. But they, a few places have these giant repositories of stuff, and you just throw your stuff up there, and they'd always be happy to have more free stuff for you.
Yeah,
that's cool.
You're muted.
I think you're muted.
Ron.
I can't hear you, Ron.
Sorry, my global talk. People started printing on my printer.
Oh.
So I was like, I didn't know how good the noise cancellation was.
Oh, we heard you.
Yeah, that's why I muted it.
I think Aaron was like, that's a noise I haven't heard in a long time.
Right. But I was going to say, like, UMich and places like that had huge archives of all of that stuff. And there's been a few people that I've even reached out to and just said, hey, like, do you still have your source code? Do you still have like a compiled copy of that? Because it was on FTP and they didn't archive any of that, and archive.org didn't archive it either. So it's if folks don't have a copy, some of that stuff is just lost. So
yeah, it's unfortunate that some of that stuff falls through the cracks, but it was a fun time. JPEG View is my main baby, but I also did a UU decoder to work with Newswatcher. So Usenet at the time was really big on the college campuses. I spent a lot of time on Usenet, and I always used Newswatcher once that came out. That was by far the best program for news. And then I always thought it was annoying because you go to the binaries news groups, not just the porn ones, but there was other good ones too. Where you could download, but it was always multi-part. There was always like it came out in like 10 messages, and you'd select all those messages in Newswatcher, and he would download them for you. But then you had to use an external program to decode them, to UU decode them, and combine them into parts. And so I never liked any of the solutions that were there. And so I wrote one that was like super easy drag and drop. You could pretty much just throw a folder full of files, and it would try to, based on the subject lines and the mixed parts and the part numbers that were encoded in the subject line, try to just put all the pieces together in the right order and decode them into files. And so John, I actually got a chance to talk to John Norstad quite a few times about projects, and we always jokingly, he always said that when he was stress testing Newswatcher, he'd go to one of the risque news groups, binaries news groups, select all, Command A, and then Command B, which was extract binaries. He called it the all BODs command, and he basically do that. It would basically download every message that was accessible in the group, and then throw them all at my program, and my program would just download them all into final images, and hopefully it would all just work. And that was sort of the goal, and it was pretty slick at the time. It worked pretty good.
Oh yeah. You were saying like it was like, I don't know like what the legacy of JPEG View. I literally used it today to do something on a vintage Mac. I just after all these years, now I feel like I got to get this postcard started. So
there you go. I actually thought about resurrecting it for my modern Dream emulator that I'm writing, because I thought I don't charge for it, but I'm like, that postcard thing was kind of cool, but people don't really send postcards. In fact, my nieces and nephews are like, they do these projects where they send a request, and you're supposed to send a postcard and then forward the request on to somebody else somewhere else, and they're supposed to send a postcard. And my wife went to go find postcards for our town in Washington, and we're like, we can't find any for our town. We can find some like Seattle generic ones, but like our town doesn't have postcards. We even went down to like City of Chamber of Commerce, and was like, this is kind of ridiculous. Postcards just aren't a thing anymore. So maybe asking people to send a physical postcard is a little much these days.
Get postcard paper, make your own.
I did get quite a lot of creative postcards, I will say. Some people made their own. They printed them on their Macs. You can see a lot of dot matrixy type printing things.
That's cool.
Some people just like took a piece of cardboard. Like there's at least a couple where there are like cereal boxes that have been like ripped out in a cardboard shape. The post office will mail anything. If you put a stamp on it, they really literally mail anything.
Yeah.
So.
Well, they'll lose anything. That's for sure. I had a big project I was going to do for Marchitosh, and I literally mailed like 20 like padded envelopes to people. Not one of them has arrived yet. And even if they were media mail, they should have made it by now. So painful.
So I'm curious, Aaron, you mentioned you had access to your girlfriend's Mac 2CX. What was the first system that you ended up getting, or was that the JPEG view and everything was written on the 2CX, or did you get?
So the first versions of JPEG view were definitely written on the 2CX. I'm trying to think if we had any other. No, I think that thing lasted until the first PowerPCs showed up.
Oh, cool.
Now, at the time the PowerPCs showed up, I had Macs at work. And because what year did the PowerPCs show up? Those
94, I think.
94? Yeah. So I always defined my Mac period as 90 to 2000, basically. So once OS X came on the bound, I was done. And, I went to college at the fall of 89, so that's basically 1990. So that was pretty much my Mac years. And I can't remember if we had another 68K based Mac. I didn't have any Quadros, didn't have 2FX, we might have had a Performa, like one of the Performa models, higher end Performa models as an intermediate one. But so basically until I had a Mac, and then as soon as the PowerPC Macs came out, I bought the 6160. I was like, I got to have one of these PowerPCs. These are awesome. And I bought one of those day and date as soon as that thing came out. I was super excited. I thought this is the time Apple's finally gonna kick Intel's butt. I was a true believer in the PowerPC, and I actually really liked it. I mean, as a machine and as a programming target, and eventually I wrote assembly language in that too, because I always end up writing assembly language in any platform I'm doing. And that was a great platform. I really enjoyed the PowerPC.
Yeah. I mean, even by looking back, the 6100 didn't have as much expandability or this or that, but it's still comparative to the other machines that were there for a lower end model. It wasn't too bad. People dump on it now, but
Yeah. Well, I mean, it definitely. I mean, it ultimately got me my job, because my job at LucasArts, because I bought Rebel Assault when it came out, for the Mac, and it was a 68,000 based program. And I ran it on my PowerPC, and because it was the lowest end PowerPC, it struggled to emulate it at full speed. So 6100 was great, and Apple would tell you that it would be just as fast as the fastest 68K systems, but it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't quite capable of that. They did a great job on it. Don't get me wrong, but it was impressive feat. But yeah, it didn't run fast enough, and so I was like, well, I knew that Apple had introduced a way that 68 code could switch between PowerPC code. It could just jump through a certain mechanism to PowerPC code, and then PowerPC code could jump back to the 68K code. And I'm like, well, if I could figure out what part is really slow about this, maybe it's something simple that I could just do. And it turned out that the really slow part was copying the bits from memory onto the screen, because it had to pixel double it. It had to blow it up 2x, because Rebel Assault was written for VGA 300 by 320 by 200. And I was getting blown up to 640 by 400. And so turned out that was the really slow part. And I'm like, well, that's just like one subroutine. Like I could rewrite that in PowerPC assembly. If I hacked that in and had the code jump there, do the PowerPC code just for that operation of copying the bits to the screen, and then return back to 68K code. And I did that, and I was like, smoothed it out beautifully on the 6100. I'm like, well, okay, this has got to be, I got to share this. And so I came up with a patch mechanism to share it and put it up on the FTP sites and various other things. And that's when I got the call from folks over at LucasArts, and they were like, we want to talk to you. And we talked to the folks there. They'll admit to the day that they were still, until they actually started talking to me, they were unsure whether they were going to sue me or whether they were going to try and hire me.
I'm glad it was the latter.
Yeah.
As it turns out, the guy who was currently doing their Mac ports wanted to move on. He wanted to stop doing Mac ports because he wanted to go work on Nintendo 64, which is ultimately where he ended up working on Nintendo 64 stuff. And so they were looking for a new Mac programmer. So by chance, because of that, I think that kind of edged them toward hire me rather than sue me. I mean, I guess they probably wouldn't have sued me. They probably just sent me a cease and desist and told me to take it down from everywhere, blah, blah, blah. But, that's how the story goes. But anyway, that got their interest into me to doing stuff. And so that's how I kind of ended up coming on board LucasArts to do their Mac ports.
Yeah, what an entrance you made. That's great.
Yeah, hey, I showed them what I knew what I was doing, so that was great.
Yeah. We had a hand-me-down 7100, and I remember playing Rebel Assault on there, and like you said, it was sluggish at times. And I remember my father downloading some patch or something that made it run better. So thank you.
Hopefully it was mine.
I remember the Rebel Assault demo that it was just like just under 200 megabytes. Mm-hmm. So I was working retail at the time, and I had a 6100 that I just blew away everything else on the system and just had it on there. So it ran from the hard drive.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, and it was like, people were like, wow, this is amazing. I'm like, you have no idea.
Yes, it is.
You have no idea the resources that are committed to this right now.
I mean, at the time, it was exciting. That was really the first Star Wars game that LucasArts did for the PC, because up until then, they'd been kind of staying away from the whole Star Wars thing and just kind of doing their own games. Mm-hmm. But, the idea of doing new Star Wars stuff was pretty exciting to people at the time. And obviously that started a whole trend.
Yeah. I was going to say, this is prequels. I mean, there was a time where people really weren't talking about Star Wars. There was the expanded universe, there were novels, but there really wasn't a lot of media out there outside of maybe a couple comic books every so often, maybe a new thing in the expanded universe. It's like, ooh, what's Prince Zizor up to this week? But is
that how you say it? We always called him Cheezor, which just made us laugh.
Oh, really? Oh, I have no idea. It's one of those things. I've only read it.
That's what we called
I've only read it, so I just don't know.
I remember playing the PC version of the game because I had the N64 version that had the text cutscenes. So the first time I played the PC version, and you hear someone say Zizor or however it's pronounced, and I'm like, "That's how you say it."
Yeah. McClunky.
That's all. Empire, right?
Yes. One of my favorite games. That was it.
Yeah, that was funny. I mean, it was exciting and a sad time, because I mean, when I went to LucasArts, they were all in on the Mac. Apple had sold them on it. PowerPC had just hit. It was becoming popular enough that you could write games and target the PowerPC, and that had the oomph to run the modern games. Apple had created Game Sprockets, which was their DirectX equivalent.
Oh yeah.
At the time. And they were doing evangelism. They were bringing people out to called them games kitchens, and they'd bring a bunch of programmers from different companies and bring them all to Austin, where I did one at Motorola with them, and they'd basically just put us in a room, basically teach us how to write the most optimal code. And then we had all the people who wrote emulators and who wrote the 68K emulator, who knew how to micro optimize for PowerPC, and a whole bunch of other people there. And we just spent 3 or 4 days just pounding and trying to optimize our code. And when I was working on Dark Forces, which was the first thing I had to do when I got to LucasArts, I had sort of had it working, but the idea was we had to basically micro optimize, a few particular things. Copying to the screen, as always, was one of the slower bits. And so, I worked with this engineer named Eric Trout, who eventually I ended up working with quite a lot of my career outside of game stuff. But at the time, he was at Apple, and he was the one who wrote the second generation, the dynamic recompiling version of the 68K emulator for PowerPC, which gave almost a 2x boost, I believe, over the first version. So he was a great guy to learn from, and I remember micro optimizing stuff with him, and it was just a lot of fun, and there's just a lot of excitement that was going on there. And so I was all in on the Mac at the time, and I was a diehard Mac guy, and so I just was I want to make as many games as possible to do it. When I got there, they were like, okay, we need you to do Dark Forces, and then right after that, we need you to do Full Throttle. And they're like, Full Throttle is easier because we've already done the Scum system, which was their adventure game engine. Yeah. We've already done Scum games before, and we ported them to the Mac. And we've done Rebel Assault, which was the video sequence player, which was, Full Throttle was basically a bolting of those two engines. It basically bolted the adventure game engine and the streaming engine from Rebel Assault so you could play all the cutscenes. Mm-hmm. And so we've kind of done that both. And then I took a look at what that was done, and I'm like, well, we need to do this all for PowerPC. And I had to recompile it all anyway, and so I started, learning sort of what LucasArts was good at in terms of writing code for multiple platforms, and what it was, needed to learn a little bit about. And so something like Full Throttle was actually pretty straightforward because the SCUM system had already been ported to many different platforms, and so therefore they'd abstracted out things like, how do you draw to the video screen? That's different on every system. How do you play sound? That's different on every system. However, how does the game run? That's the same on all systems. So you really just want to compile that core stuff, because you want the game to be identical on all systems, but you want the outward connections to the system to there you go.
Monkey Island.
Very nice. But you want your outward you want your how you talk to the outside world through the operating system and the video hardware and that kind of thing it has to be changed. And so that was well done. And Vince Lee, who developed the Insane system, which was what Rebel Assault was built on, he had done a pretty good job of doing that. But like Dark Forces was really just written as a PC game. I mean, that thing was written a lot of assembly language right for the PC. It was written to take advantage of some tweaks of VGA and how VGA worked and that kind of thing. And so that one I really had to actually put a lot of work into, partly because Mac users were expecting us to do better than the PC because we had this Power PC. The whole mantra was, Apple's got the Power PC, it kicks x86's butt. We're gonna show off the thing, and they wanted us to help them show off the Power PC by writing games, and not only writing games, making them better on the Mac. And so we had to actually upgrade the Dark Forces engine from 320 by 200 graphics to 640 by 400, and that was a big lift. The Power PC was capable of it. I mean, if you played it, it does work. But the engine itself, it had a few things. I mean, a lot of the calculations in there were designed to just not overflow as long as you were rendering to a small enough screen size. And once you doubled the screen size you're rendering to, those calculations, now they overflowed and produced weird results, and you fell out of the world or other kind of problems, And so we had to track down all those kind of issues and do that. And they actually did some additional high-res artwork for it, which is really nice too. So like the loading screen and a few other screens were actually redone for the Mac. For Dark Forces. Now for Full Throttle, it was really just a straightforward direct port. So you just got regular graphics. You had there was a smoothing effect that you could turn on the Mac, which basically tried to smooth out the pixels as you blew them up from 320 by 200 to 640 by 400. You would smooth them out. And Eric Johnston, the guy who preceded me as the Mac porter, he had invented an algorithm to do that. They called it EPX, and he used it on like the old Indiana Jones games, like, back in the day, and the Monkey Island games on the Mac. And so they all use this algorithm for smoothing. And so I ported that as well. So Full Throttle had that, but it was really just a straight port. So ultimately, even though we did a lot of great work on Dark Forces and enhanced it, I was like, this is a lot of work, and I don't think the Mac market is big enough to warrant us putting that much effort into every game. And so I was like, for future games, what we need to do is to talk to each development team ahead of time and say, you need to, make sure that how you draw to the screen is separated out, how you make sound is separated out, how you take your input is separated out, and certain other things are separated out in a way that we can easily just plug in different modules, replace that for a different operating system, and then make it run on the Mac. And so, we did Dark Forces on Full Throttle, and then the next two were The Dig and Rebel Assault 2, and those were also pretty much slam dunks because they were on all the same engines. They needed a little bit of optimization, but they were the same engine. So since I had some time, since these are all pretty easy, I was like frustrated that the two games that had never been released on the Mac before, that had kind of skipped the Mac between when Eric stopped doing Mac ports and when I joined and did stuff, were Day of the Tentacle and Sam & Max the Road. Those two had never gone to the Mac, and they weren't planning to do anything on the Mac. They were just going to say, well, we missed those, we're just going to do future games. And I said, well, I don't like that as a Mac user. And so in my spare time, I basically, since they were SCUM games too, it wasn't hard to get them up and running as well on the Mac. And I just kind of did that in my spare time. And then I showed it to the marketing people, and they were kind of taken aback. They were like, well, we weren't expecting you to do this. What are we going to do with it? Are we actually going to ship this or not? And the real issue was not so much the work, because the porting work was pretty easy. The real work was we had to get a bunch of people to come in and test it. So we had a Mac testing crew, and they needed to find the time to work into their schedule testing these games that they didn't have planned to on the schedule. And so that was really kind of the challenge for it. But they found the time in the schedule, and I'm really glad they got out, because that meant that there was no gaps in the Mac releases during that time. I plugged those gaps, and then we kind of went forward. We did the Dig and Rebel Assault 2, and those were easy. And then the next two were, I believe, Afterlife and Mortimer. And Afterlife was interesting. That was a new engine, and they were actually struggling to get out the door on time. And so I actually joined and helped with the Windows version a little bit while also doing the Mac port at the same time. It was mostly just keeping the Mac port working. Like once it worked, I was just basically making sure that as they kept fixing things and making things work and getting it ready to ship, that they didn't like screw up something that was already working on the Mac side.
Yeah.
So we got that shipped, and then Mortimer was a kids game that was basically Rebel Assault 2 for kids.
I loved that when I was a kid.
It's a very rare game. Very few people know about it. My goal is to make more people know about it because it's got the best theme song.
Yes, we had like a hand-me-down Power Mac or whatever, and that disc was like always in the CD-ROM drive. It was a birthday gift or something like that, and it just like you're on this weird green snail, and there are animals, and you're zapping things, and it was pretty fun.
Yeah, no, it is basically Rebel Assault for kids.
That's great.
Let me think. What else did I do? We of course did the PAX. I apparently went back and actually reported Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, which I barely remember doing.
Oh, wow.
But I did a PowerPC native version of that.
Yep.
And
didn't know that.
The only reason I did that was because I asked. So I know a couple people now who are working on like Scum VM and other things that are used to run the Scum games these days, and they were looking at the Mac versions, and they said you designed these about screens that were special on the Mac that were different from everything else. And yeah, they were all programmer art that I had done back in the day. And I basically took some snapshot from in-game and like dimmed it and then wrote the text over the top of all the credits for the Mac version. And they dug up one from the Fate of Atlantis, which I was like, well, clearly I did a port of that, but it was so foggy in my memory that I didn't remember doing that or that it even shipped outward. A lot of times I did stuff and it never shipped. So
yeah, that was another fun one. And again, just
I love it.
It was great to have these on the Mac because I grew up, we just had a Mac in the household. So, any games that we could get our hands on, Dark Forces. And I loved that every disc was packed with demos. So even if you just had the one game, you could see what else was out there for the Mac,
Uh-huh. The demos were great. And I always forget how many demos we packed on there. But I've been working on my new emulator Dream, which is all LucasArts games. And, the goal is to be able to take any version of a PC release of a LucasArts game and drag it onto the program, and it'll find all the versions of the games that are in there and identify them and everything like that. And some of the games in that era were just packed with 5 or 6 demos of other games on top of the game that you got. Lots of different versions. The other one that was very interesting, I don't even have the package anymore, was the Indiana Jones and his Desktop Adventures.
Yeah.
Which was like this little mini game. It was almost like a desk accessory. Like on the Macs, they had desk accessories.
Yeah, it was
like a desk accessory game. But the problem with that was it was written for Windows, and it was written using MFC, which is like the Microsoft Core library. And so porting that to the Mac really was a labor of love. I mean, I really had to gut the whole thing and rewrite tons of it to make it work. But for some reason, I really wanted to do it. So and they did another game on the same engine for Star Wars called Yoda Stories, but that never made it to the Mac.
Yeah.
Oh, damn.
That comes well with my next question. What's the toughest part of the porting of PC games to the Macintosh?
So really, it got pretty easy by the time I was, a year and a half into my tenure at LucasArts. The hardest part was probably the sound, I would say, because this was in the era just on the edge of digital sound. So the games like Sam & Max Day of the Tentacle, they were all MIDI based or Roland MT32 based, and it was really with the beginning of Full Throttle was really the first Scum game that was fully digital. And so at that point, the game sounded the same on the Mac as it did on the PC. But anything before that, we basically had to, on the PC, how it sounded depended on which sound card you had. So if you had a Sound Blaster 16, it sounded kind of chintzy. If you had the big bucks and had like a Roland Sound Canvas or a MT32, it sounded pretty expansive and nice. And there were tons of other options that you could have, for on the PC side. And on the Mac, there wasn't like a sound card ecosystem like there was on the PC. You pretty much had you had a stereo deck. That's all you had. So you basically could just throw samples at it, and that's all you got. So essentially what we had to do on the Mac was we had to write our own MIDI engine. And that's what Eric Johnston wrote one for the early games. that basically was 8-bit sound. It took a bunch of 8-bit samples every time you played an instrument. It would take a sample of an instrument. It's kind of like a wavetable, basically, that were on the PC sound cards, and it would scale the pitch up and down based on how it was. And they might have multiple samples depending on the upper pitches might have a different sample than the middle pitches, and the lower pitches might have a different sample for a given instrument. And it would play it. It would adjust the volume and an envelope to kind of make the sound fade out and that kind of thing. And so there's a lot that goes into that. And Eric had written a MIDI engine for the Mac, and they had to get some sound sample packs, or I don't know where they got them from back in Eric's day. But when I came on, I'm like, well, we should try to do upgrade the sound as well, because it was all 8-bit sound. And when you mix a bunch of 8-bit sound, it starts to sound crunchy and staticky, especially on the Mac. Macs had 16-bit sound at that point pretty commonly, especially the Power PCs. And I'm like, okay, well, let's try to get 16-bit. So I originally started where we'd take 8-bit samples and mix them into 16-bit, but eventually I think we actually got proper 16-bit samples, and we hired a guy to create a set of patches. I can't remember. It was like an outside Steve Hales, I believe, was the company, and he owned a company, and he licensed packs of samples. And so I think we got some kind of like MIDI sample pack from him, and I wrote a brand new MIDI emulator to basically run at runtime, generate n channels of MIDI output based on the commands that were sent in, take the samples, scale them, and mix them all together on the fly and run them out the Mac's DAC. And so that was, I'd never done anything like that level of sound processing before. So that was one of those things where generally if I get a chance to learn some new skill or do something really cool, I'll jump at the opportunity. And so that was definitely one of those cases where I'm like, well, this sounds cool. Let's see if I can write a MIDI engine. Obviously, I had Eric's example to go from to see like how it's done, but I pretty much had to redo the whole thing to support 16-bit and a bunch of other features. And so if there's any complaints about how those games sounded, on the Mac, it was fixed. You got the samples pack that we shipped, and sometimes it sounded better than a PC, and sometimes it didn't. And we weren't really in control, and there wasn't really a lot of time or money spent to improve that much beyond what we shipped with. I think we tried to get something that was good, but we didn't really have the resources to be able to really spruce it up or do a lot of back and forth and fine tuning of the samples. And so I think we did a decent job, but I haven't heard it in a long time, so maybe if I might be pretty cringe at this point.
I have. And that was actually one of the things I wanted to kind of ask you about, is about because the system by which you had the samples changed kind of seemingly like between the titles. And so some of the early titles just literally have sound samples in the executable of the, or not, in the resource fork of the application. Right. So you could just go in there and listen to those. And if you're handy, you can even replace them and put different samples in there and make it sound crazy if you really want to. But I thought that was really kind of a very interesting hack to sort of just like, oh, well, I just need the sample. So it's kind of like a Mellotron, where it's like you have a sample and it's like, we'll just pitch it up, we'll pitch it down. You would bend it to whatever you needed it to be. And then later titles seem to use a more traditional, like QuickTime instrument kind of implementation almost.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know whether we could have used the QuickTime instruments looking back on it, because it was available at the time, and I don't remember when that stuff showed up. But that would have been handy, because being able to leverage that rather than having to license them out from there, and have Apple actually do the quality control rather than us try to make that work would have been interesting.
Well, I mean, whether it sounded different or not, I was just super happy as a kid not knowing the difference between a platform or another, just to have access to those games.
Yeah, I was just happy to be able to play the games.
My problem is I thought it all sounded great, because I was like, I wrote the code that did this, and wow, that's amazing that my code is actually doing. Sometimes I kind of get enamored with it. That's something I did. I'm kind of like, wow, I did that. That's pretty sweet.
Monkey Island is kind of like, maybe if I'm not saying, again, just super happy to have had this stuff. But I will say Monkey Island is like a worst offender kind of thing, because there's that music just is ingrained in my brain forever, like from the MT32. And then you listen to the Mac version, and there's sort of like this like little like trill that plays, where it's like, and it's like on the Mac. No, the sample is not correct, and
Yeah.
it plays like just a little bit early. And I know that there is some settings in there where you can say, like, you could set the sound quality. So if you have like a Mac 2, or you've got like an older machine, like kind of pitching, like, kind of setting that slider down really did improve the performance in the game, just by necessity on how Macs work. But yeah, it was just a weird experience, kind of some of that stuff, like in the very beginning. But by the end, everything was very level in terms of like the quality of the audio and stuff. Because I had a PC friend, I was showing him like the Mac version of some of the stuff, and he was like, I don't know, that sounds a little off. And I was like, well, what sound card do you have? Is it Gravis Ultrasound? I was like, how do you even have that working? What are you talking about, money bags? Get out of here.
Yeah, that's very true. Well, I won't take any credit for Monkey Island. I never got a chance to touch those games. That was all before my time. So, but anything from Day of the Tentacle onward, you can blame on me. And Fate of Atlantis, I think if you use the PowerPC version, you'll get the same samples. And I think that was an upgrade over what shipped for the 68K, because I think it was a better set of samples. But sadly, we had to stop doing Mac ports. Basically, I think Indie Desktop was one of the last ones I did officially, though I had Outlaws, Jedi Knight, and Shadows of the Empire all running on the Mac. The problem was that the latter two required a 3D accelerator pretty much. Jedi Knight technically didn't, but it pretty much did. And it just wasn't, the market penetration just wasn't there on the Macs for 3D acceleration at the time. The nice thing was 3D effects you could, and actually I was using Glide, so I was actually talking directly to a 3D effects card because there wasn't like an Apple equivalent of Direct 3D at the time. And so we were talking directly to 3DFX. So if you had a 3DFX card, I was able to play Shadows of the Empire on my Mac, and I had Jedi Knight up and running, and I had Outlaws running, which I thought totally should have shipped on the Mac, because I mean that was still Dark Forces engine. It was running at the same resolution that Dark Forces ran at, and it was running pretty good. And I think I can't remember. I think we even had Did we have no? I never got a chance to write the networking code for Mac. So we didn't have multiplayer going, but that was ultimately something I wanted to do, was to have the Macs talk to the PCs and be able to play against them. But eventually what happened was I was working on Outlaws porting it, and the Outlaws team was like, hey, we need some help. And so they brought me in, and I ended up doing like the weapons system, the little cash register tabs at the bottom, and the changing of the weapons and the behaviors of weapons and stuff. And then I ended up doing a rewrite of the networking system with another developer, Rich Fife there. He and I pretty much, the first version of the networking system just did not work very well, and so we just pretty much gutted it one day, or one long weekend, I recall, and we all read up on Dead Reckoning and how it all worked and how to do all the network techniques, and then we wrote one, and we ended up being able to play like 16-player LAN games on Outlaws, which was pretty impressive at the time. I mean, at the time Doom was limited to 8, and doing one-upping Doom and having solid network play at that point was kind of an accomplishment at the time. So
that's cool. Yeah, and that you spoke an answer to a question that I was going to ask you, but from someone who adored Dark Forces when Jedi Knight came out for the PC, I remember like putting it on my birthday list, but we didn't have a PC, so I never got to play that. But I'm thankful that the sequel to that was ported to the Mac, so at least that was fun.
Yeah. No, those good times. I really enjoyed that, and I eventually got pulled off to do Windows stuff full time. And I helped out on Jedi Knight with some of the UI stuff, and then I was the lead programmer on the sequel pack to Jedi Knight, which is called Mysteries of the Sith. And I was at that point pretty much a Windows programmer at work, but I was still a Mac programmer at home, basically. But then eventually, I on the side I was doing emulation programming. So I discovered Stella, which was an Atari 2600 emulator, and they needed somebody to maintain their Mac port. And I'm like, I'm a Mac guy, I can do that. So that became like my side hobby. While I was doing Windows stuff, I'm like, well, I can do Windows stuff at work and still do the Mac stuff at home. And so I got a chance to port that. And then I discovered MAME, which, as I said, I grew up an arcade kid. So like that was the ultimate thing for me to want to do. And so I eventually got in touch with Brad Oliver, who was the guy who had done a MAME port to the Mac. And I said, hey, I want to help you out. And so I think I did some UI improvements and helped him out with some, basics on the Mac, and then said, I know assembly language and I know these old platforms, and I'm wondering if maybe I can learn how to do this emulation thing. And so I decided, well, my favorite game of all time, Mappy, was not emulated by MAME at the time, and so I said, well, I wonder what it would take to do that. And so that became my entrance into emulation at the time. I was also really inspired by Digital Eclipse had released their Williams packs, their like Joust and Defender and Robotron packs, which were Mac only at the time, which was pretty sweet. And they were emulations of the original arcade games. So I was like, and I forget exactly what year those came out, but that was before MAME. And I'd always been inspired by that. And so that also inspired me to get into learning to do emulation on my own. So all that kind of conspired for me to start delving into emulation. And eventually that really became what I wanted to do. I mean, pretty quickly, I was like, God, if I could just do emulation all the time, this game stuff, games were okay, but each game was getting bigger. Mm-hmm. And games are, teams of 50 people now with, 20 artists and, 10 programmers. And it's done by a large committee of people. And I was like, that's fine and all, but like, I didn't really like that kind of game production. I was a guy who wanted to write games on my own, or write arcade games, which were written by like 1 or 2 people at the time when I was growing up. And I'm kind of a lone wolf when it comes to that kind of thing. So I really enjoy kind of working on my own and that kind of thing. And so I said, well, time for me to exit the game industry. And I started looking around, and I ended up getting a job at Connectix, which was a Mac spot. I think the other reason I liked Connectix was that they were Mac focused. They were laser focused on the Mac. And I wanted to be a Mac programmer so bad, and full-time Mac programmer, because I'd been doing that for the last, however many years. And so I said, Connectix is the place. They're doing emulation. They have virtual PC. Mm-hmm. And I can go help out on virtual PC maybe, and help out on some of their other cool products. They were doing the Quick Cam at the time. They had RAM Doubler, which I thought was a pretty sweet hack.
Yeah.
And
we're going to use that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's how I ended up at Connectix, and that ended up from me moving. Fortunately, they were still in the Bay Area, so in Silicon Valley, but they were more in Silicon Valley as opposed to George Lucas, who was kind of up in Marin County in the Northern California area. And so we had to move across the Golden Gate Bridge to go work for Connectix. But yeah, that was fun, because like my first thing at Connectix was I got to emulate the Sound Blaster 16. I was decided to upgrade the sound from the original Sound Blaster to the 16-bit sound. And so I got a chance to, actually emulate the sound card, which was kind of an interesting thing. The way it was an ISA card we emulated, and the old ISA cards actually had this very esoteric plug and play mechanism. And we didn't want people to have to configure their PCs for which IRQs and DMAs and stuff when they did that, because virtual PCs target at Mac users. We don't want them to have to mess with that stuff if they want to. And so I figured, well, I had to get this plug and play mechanism working. And so I actually implemented the plug and play mechanism for ISO, which is, it turns out that one of the guys who contributed to that was our CTO. So he was able to offer me a little bit of advice. But it was just like this crazy system. And that was a lot of fun. But while I was there, like shortly after there, we were talking and over lunch with some of the guys, and I was talking about how there were some other emulators out there. And one of the other emulators I thought was really cool was this PlayStation emulator that was public domain, and that you could, run discs. And they were like, but the PlayStation discs are black. There's some special CDs, and you can't just put them in a regular CD-ROM. And I'm like, well, actually, it turns out you can. There's nothing special about them at all, except for the color of the black disc. And so you're able to put them in there. You can see all the files and that kind of thing. And so we started talking about the idea of like, well, wouldn't it be cool? This is right around the time the first bubble iMacs were coming out. The Bondi Blue, bubble iMac, 233 megahertz G3. And we said, wouldn't it be cool if we could target an emulator, a commercial emulator that would actually run PlayStation games and on the Mac? We thought, well, that would be a pretty neat thing, but like, what's the chances of that? And I said, well, if you give me like a month or two to kind of hack at it a little bit on the side, maybe I'll see, how feasible this thing is. And so I spent a pretty furious amount of time. I was really excited about the idea, because emulating games is like what I was doing in MAME, and now we're emulating, another type of game thing. But this the idea of console. You could bring games to the Mac in a large variety, because basically, if you could put any PlayStation game in your Mac and play it, to me that was pretty compelling. And so we got it going, and eventually it just picked up steam. People were like, hey, this is really neat. I got the system booting. And then our lead programmer, Eric Trout, who I mentioned before, he for 64K or 68K, sorry, 68K, 68,000 to PowerPC. He'd written that for Apple, and then he came to Connectix, and he'd written the emulator for Virtual PC. So he wrote the x86 to PowerPC translator, and so he came in and jumped in and helped write a MIPS R3000 translator to PowerPC for the PlayStation emulator we were working on. And it snowballed pretty quickly. And I looking back, I can't even believe how quickly we put that thing together. I mean, we did it in 6 months. I mean, I started in Connectix in July, and we shipped it at Macworld in January, the following January.
That's
and
right.
we
I remember
pulled
the
that we literally run, off. Connectix was very low. We didn't press the discs in those quantities. We were literally just pressing them ourselves in our room and brought them to the show. And Steve Jobs did a keynote about it and everything like that. And it was a pretty exciting time. But of course, we got sued, and that was we tried to do it legit. We actually had a whole thing where we did a dog and pony show for the execs there and showed them what we were doing and said, hey, can we license your operating system, your BIOS, basically, because that would have been the legit way to go. And then we just say, hey, admit that we're doing something that's kind of neat here. We're opening up a new market to you, Mac users who might want to play this.
Yeah.
But I think they felt that, I always say this, all the console makers want to have iron control over their distribution.
Yeah.
They weren't believing that we could produce, consistent results. And so they thought that would tarnish their trademark. And so those were the arguments that they made against us.
Did they play any PlayStation 1 games if they're worried about
when we brought them to
consistency?
them, we brought it
I just mean because every model is just constantly blooming and growing and like shifting, and
at the time it was state of the art. I mean, that was,
it's true.
Yeah, we think we laugh now, but I mean, it's if you look back at the early 3D arcade games, they're all pretty janky. But
Sure.
At the time, we did our dog and pony show. We showed them Crash Bandicoot, which at the time was one of the top games. It was running nicely on the Mac. We brought like a PlayStation clone controller, like a Logitech, dual stick controller. And then, of course, the great story is like the guy's like, does it run any game? And I could tell he was going to try and trip us up. He was going to be like, okay, I'm going to pick a game off the shelf. And so he turned around. They had a big, in this conference room we were in, they had a bookshelf of all the games, like every game that they shipped. He turned around, he pulled a game off the shelf. Unfortunately, it was Ridge Racer, which was the one game that we had worked super hard on getting right. And so as soon as he pulled that out, I breathed a sigh of relief. I'm like, yeah, that's going to run great. And so he did that. So, I think they didn't get a bad impression of how it ran, I don't think. I think it looked good, but I just don't think they wanted to allow anybody else to have control over it. And, my own personal grudge against Sony is that I never allow a Sony product into my house from now on. So that's my personal grudge. And, that's why my kid's an Xbox kid and not a PlayStation kid. Partly, also I was at Microsoft, so I can't exactly claim neutrality there. But
well, talking about emulators, would you tell us about your dream emulator for LucasArts games?
So so basically at 2000, I stopped working on doing Mac stuff, and Microsoft came and bought Connectix in 2003 because we did Virtual PC. And by the way, the reason I gave up on the Mac, it looks like a silly reason in retrospect, but I was crushed that they went with OS X instead of trying to fix Copeland. I was so on board for Copeland. I was so excited about all the stuff. They'd hyped Copeland like crazy, and I was 100% sold. And so when they did the about face and did the OS X thing, I'm like, this is not Copeland. I don't really want to learn how to program basically to a new operating system. And so I kind of said, I had enough. And about that time I was doing mostly Windows programming at work anyway, so it was a pretty easy transition. But so in 2003, Microsoft bought Connectix, and so we moved up to Microsoft, and I worked on Virtual PC for Windows there, which was a product that they shipped for a while, and then they started including it as like a compatibility pack for XP when Windows 7 came out. And then we did a product called Virtual Server, which turned into Hyper-V. If you're at all in Microsoft stuff, that's how you do virtual machines on Microsoft these days. So basically, we created sort of the first virtual machine thing. And now Azure is basically built on, Hyper-V, some multiple, 2 decades later version of Hyper-V.
Yeah.
But, it's ultimately, I'm sure some of my code is still lurking in there. And in the meantime, I went off to work on other things. And I, ported Windows to ARM. Basically, I was working on the Windows versions that ran on ARM ARM chips. So today you can buy Windows on ARM devices, and that's running a lot of my code because I did a lot of the porting work there. So in the meantime, in the background, I still worked on MAME for many years. And then I had a kid, and I decided that I didn't have time for emulation anymore. So I took a hiatus from doing emulation and that kind of thing. And I came back. I tried to get back into MAME, but the culture had changed quite a bit, and the people running it, we butted heads quite a bit about how things should be doing. And I kind of still missed being in charge back when I was in charge of MAME for a while. And so I said, I don't really want to work on this anymore. It's too stressful for me to be working on this. I should go and do my own thing. So I was like, okay, well, what am I going to do? So around the time Connectix was bought, 2003-ish, I had contacted LucasArts, and I said, hey, I did all your Mac ports of the Scum games, of the adventure games, but right now on Windows, you're kind of screwed because more and more it's getting harder to run the DOS versions of those games on Windows. Even with all your compatibility tricks and hacks, it's just not a pleasant experience. I'm like, you should contract with me to basically do for Windows what I did for the Mac, which is basically to take the old code, port it onto a new system, and use modern Windows calls and make them run as native Windows apps. And they said, sure. We actually have an idea. We want to do a full throttle thing. We want full throttle to be run on modern Windows systems. We actually want to make a downloadable version of Full Throttle, which in 2003 was really tough because Full Throttle was a CD game, and they wanted me to help them shrink it down as tiny as possible so that it would be downloadable, because downloading even 100 megabytes at the time was a big ask. It's still mostly over dial-up. So I know eventually, long story short, I did all these ports for LucasArts, and I gave them to them, and they dribbled out some of the versions here and there, usually to licensees in Europe. So like there's a French version of Day of the Tentacle that runs natively on Windows, but they never re-released the English version. There's Sam & Max got a pretty often released The Dig and Full Throttle, and I think Indie Fate of Atlantis did, and Loom even did. So some of them got released, but not all of them did. So I was kind of salty about the fact that they didn't really take these Windows ports seriously. Like they used them in like opportunistic ways as like a pack-in thing, and they threw some resources at them. There was talk. I heard a rumor that they might have used some of the Monkey Island port that I did as for their Monkey Island special editions, but I never got any confirmation of that. And then later somebody told me that they didn't really end up using any of that stuff. So but I was just like, why couldn't you just have released, like, I set them up so that you could release the executables. Like you could basically install your game or copy the files from your game or have the CD of your game in the system, download an executable, and the modern Windows executable would find the system that you already had installed and just run the game, but you wouldn't have the horrible experience of trying to run a DOS game. You could just run it in modern Windows. Yeah. And with the EPX smoothing and all the other features that we had on the Mac. And so I said, well, I'd like to recreate that. And I had an idea. I was like, I could run an emulator. If I had an emulator that would run these old DOS games, I could wrap it in a way that's user-friendly enough that, like, you could easily install these old games that you had and run them without a lot of friction. I mean, yeah, you can run them in DOSBox, but you have to install, deal with configuring DOSBox in a way to make them run. Sometimes it's not always easy. Though they've tried to make it a lot easier. You can run them in ScumVM, but my argument with ScumVM is that they're recreating the engine. They're not running the original code. Right. And they've done a really good job of recreating the engine, don't get me wrong, but there's part of me that still kind of wanted, to be running the original code. And so I said, well, what if I wrote an emulator that kind of had kind of a quality of life feeling of the old adventure game ports that I did that never really got the wide release that I wanted them to, but was on modern systems and was an emulator. And so I said, well, I'll write an emulator for x86, so a CPU emulator for that. And then I had written a emulator for like Sound Blaster type FM sound already. I had done that for another project, for MAME actually. I'd written a freely licensed version of that called YMFM. So I kind of had that in my pocket. And I'd recently written a sound font system to do like wavetable type sounds. And I was like, okay, I got that already there. So I had a lot of the pieces to throw together to build this emulator that would run the adventure games. And so I started off, I'm like, I just want to run all the adventure games. And they're all DOS-based, so, except for Curse of Monkey Island. We'll set that one aside. But I'll run all the DOS-based games in my emulator and provide a nice interface. And so it's really easy and user-friendly to do so. So that was Dream 1.0. And, I put it out and it had, some interest. One nice side effect is that it encouraged the Scum VM folks to relook at some of the Scum games that they had done and touch up some of the details that they have glossed over. Excuse me. They glossed over some details that like the save load screens and that kind of thing were not true to the original, and so they actually went back and put some effort into doing that. So in a way, I kind of pushed them. But I consider, people say, well, are you a rival with Scum VM? And I'm like, or why would I use your emulator when I can run Scum VM? And it's a legit question. If all you're interested in are the adventure games, that's fine. But what I did was I went beyond the adventure games. So the first thing I did was I did Curse of Monkey Island, which was a Windows native game. And to do that, I had to write like a mini version of Windows to run as in an emulation. So basically, every time they try to talk to Windows, they're talking to my emulator, and my emulator is doing what Windows would do to go full screen or to draw graphics to the screen or play sounds. And I did that to get Curse of Monkey Island running. And then I took that a step further and got Grim Fandango and Escape from Monkey Island running as well in the emulator. And that involved, basically emulating a 3D card. And the 3D card is actually emulated fully in software. And that's just one of those things that I like to do for fun, is to write 3D software emulations of that kind of thing. I'd done it for MAME. I'd written a 3DFX emulator for MAME. So I kind of knew how to do that whole thing. So I'm like, well, I'll just be a generic 3D card that you can do that. And that's how I get Grim Fandango and Escape from Monkey Island working. And part of the reason for that is that to try and make that work on a modern card, you have to convert all the drawing commands to a modern card. But they did kind of, in the early days, they took advantage of things like, all the backgrounds are pre-rendered. And on Grim Fandango, not only is it pre-rendered, but they pre-populate the Z buffer, which is basically tells you which things are behind, what depth each pixel is in your scene. And so that, that way Manny can draw behind a table or in front of a table. That's all baked into the scene. But you got to actually directly splat that Z buffer data into video memory, and it has to be at the same resolution as the pre-rendered backgrounds. And so they were taking advantage of stuff like that, and they were talking to very early versions of Direct 3D. And so I felt like by doing it all in software, I could have control. I don't have to worry about trying to make that work on a modern system. Modern systems prefer that you just draw everything and you don't actually try to reach back in and modify the buffers that they're talking to and that kind of thing. So I was like, it'll be easier for me to just write a software 3D, a virtual. It looks like a hardware 3D card to the game, but on the system is in software. Wow. And Escape from Monkey Island, I was like, well, it's the same engine, so I should just do the same thing there. Though it's throwing a lot more polygons. I was actually kind of astounded at how many polygons it's throwing. People bash on Escape from Monkey Island, and the tank controls are honestly the thing that I hate most about it, and Grim Fandango. But minus the tank controls, I actually find a lot of charm in the graphics. The early 3D graphics. It's not the greatest, but I think it's totally serviceable for what it is, and actually looks better than I think I expected it to, because I of course left before that came out and I never got a chance to really play it. Yeah. So, but then after that, I was like, okay, well, what else can I do? And I thought, well, maybe I'll expand Dream to emulate more LucasArts games. And so I started adding Dark Forces and the space sims, TIE Fighter and X-Wing, and then I started going back in time and emulating on earlier games, the old Night Shift and Master Blazer, which is like a ball blazer kind of thing, and that kind of thing. So, and then I started going forward in time, and so every version of Dream, I emulate more stuff. And right now, I'm working on Dream 4.0. So, and I've emulated everything from the beginning of every PC game, from the beginning of LucasArts history to the year 2000, including all the Lucas Learning games, which is a lot of educational stuff that they did there. Wow. And it's also all that my emulator now runs on the PC. I originally did it just for Windows, but I actually did a Mac port and a Linux port. So the ironic thing is I went back to the Mac finally a couple of years ago to do this port. It's barely doing Mac stuff though. It's pretty generic. It's just using standard libraries to talk to the Mac. But I'm like, I'm writing Mac code again. It's kind of funny. Of course, I find myself mostly cursing at some of the decisions that Apple has made, because I'm so used to how Windows works.
Yeah. Well, looking back at all those LucasArts projects, now that you're back into playing around with a lot of them, especially ones that never got ported to the Mac, which is thank you for giving an option for us Mac heads still. Did you have a favorite project that you worked on at LucasArts that comes to mind when you've been revisiting a lot of these titles?
Yeah, I would say Outlaws is probably my favorite. I think it's because like the Mac ports, I ported them, so I didn't really have much involvement in the actual game. Outlaws, I think because I actually worked on the game, and there's a few things I can point to that, like, I did that, you know, I worked on that particular spot, or I had this thing there. It's got a feel for it. And I also feel like I'm rooting for the underdog, and Outlaws was always sort of like the black sheep of the genre, and that, like, it's got a lot of critical acclaim now, I think, because people look back on it and see what it was. But at the time, it was really kind of shunted aside pretty quickly in the glut of 3D Doom-like and Quake-like shooters. And, you know, Quake came out shortly afterwards. I think, in fact, it might even been before. Quake might have actually appeared before Outlaws. So we were sort of like a 2.5D shooter coming out at the time that 3D was all the rage. And but I just think the animation and the
cell shaded design,
it's great.
It's great.
Beautiful. And the music is, of course, awesome. I mean, Clint Bajakian did a super amazing job on that. I mean, that soundtrack should have won all the awards. I don't even know if it did, but it should have.
Yeah. Well, now
I definitely have a fondness for that.
Yeah. A lot of people will be able to go back and play it now. You know, it was on the Mac. Now I can boot it up here. You know.
Yeah. Just go out on Usenet. It's already been uploaded. You just have to UUD code and stick all the stuff back together. And you're
together. Yeah. Hey, another question. Outside of Dream, what projects do you have on the horizon?
So, like I said, the way I work with programming is I have my one project, and then anytime I want to do something interesting, I figure out a way to do it within the context of that project. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I actually don't have another project that's that active. I mean, I have, you know, I run a couple of websites that I started before. I worked on Dream. The postcardware.net, which I mentioned before, that I kind of run. And I have like little tools and stuff that I've written here and there, but I haven't really decided on another project. I think the thing is, I've got a lot invested in Dream, and it's certainly more capable of an emulator than just running LucasArts games. And so I think the question is, what do I do with that? You know, I don't want to just put another general purpose emulator out there, because then there's no differentiation between what it does. And a lot of what Dream does is it makes it easy to set up and install these games, and just really low friction with a nice interface. You know, I spent a lot of time putting polish on the interface and you know, providing nice features, but not overwhelming levels of features. And I feel like the emulator trap is to try and just say, well, I've got a general purpose emulator, I'll just release it as such and let everybody throw everything at it. And the other thing is, you know, it's not open source, which, you know, of course people gripe at me about, but, you know, I support open source, but the main reason it's not open source is that I don't really want to work with anybody else. And as I said, I'm kind of a lone wolf, and it's not so much that I want to hide my source. It's just that if I make it open source, then inevitably people will want to collaborate or send in updates or push me in directions that I don't want to go. And I'm like, you know, I think when I'm done, or I've kind of felt like I've exhausted what it is, I'll probably put at least part, if not most of the code up as open source. But I think in the meantime, I'm keeping it to myself just for my own benefit, my own sanity.
I agree with you on the simplistic ways that you're trying to do with keeping the UI easy for people to just drag and drop. Because my own experience, you know, the new MAME in the Macintosh is very complex, very difficult. I'm using another interface. I don't remember the name of it, but it's difficult to select games and play anything.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, these days MAME is mostly used as an engine that other front ends sit in front of and provide an interface. I mean, as a developer, we would always use the engine directly because it's, you know, you're iterating on it and you want to use the built-in features and stuff. But I think there are some people who do use it raw, but I think a lot of people put a nice front end on it, and it's kind of designed that way. But I mean, it's so complex, and it's only gotten more complex since I left. You know, when I left, there was still a sister project called MESS, whose aim was to emulate consoles and computers. And MAME was strictly arcade. And I liked that division, honestly, because I felt like trying to blend them together would just, like, MESS was already a hairball of stuff even before it merged with MAME. And when they merged it with MAME, it was like it was a hairball on top of a hairball. And like, it's still, I feel like it's just the complexity level of it is just, you know, kind of insane. And I think about, you know, all the stuff that it still can't do and how you would incorporate the configuration of that to even make that work. I don't know. I never wanted to work on a project that was that level of complexity. And honestly, that was another reason why I was sort of less interested in MAME. Is when I came back and revisited it, I was kind of like, I worked on a couple of synthesizers. I emulated a couple of synthesizers and a couple of I worked on like analog sound emulation for the old Cinematronics games and this early Sega games, and that was fun, but it was a very focused area. But I didn't really want to do a lot of synthesizer work long term, and I only cared about the arcade stuff. Most of the non-arcade stuff I wasn't really that interested in, and the project was just so huge, and making changes to it just rippled anywhere. And it's back when I was running the show, I felt emboldened to, if I needed to make a change, as long as I went through and updated every driver that needed to be touched as a result of that change, it was okay. And we could just bring the whole thing forward and kind of move things forward. But it's the amount of complexity that's in it now, it just makes it even harder to try and institute changes like that and move things forward. Yeah. I think there's only one guy who has the capability to do it. He's running the show now, and I think it's not the technical capability. It's just more like you got to have the wherewithal to push it through and manage the project and not break things too much.
That makes sense.
So,
yep. Well, Aaron, we're coming up on 90 minutes here. We've got some questions from the audience.
Sure.
Let me go through and roll those out. So Curtis Boyle says, hey, did you get any royalties based on the sales of any of the LucasArts games, or was it just straight contract work?
No, it was all contract work. I mean, when I was there as an employee, so they just, they'd give you a bonus for things that worked well. I think I never got to the project manager level. So I think the project managers did have some profit participation, but the programmers on the system didn't. And then any contract work I did was just contract work. It was just a fixed cost.
Okay. Curtis also asks, hey, did you meet any of the people that worked actually on the Lucasfilm side?
Sadly, no. I mean, the one thing we did get as a perk was we got to early screenings of films that ILM worked on, and not just films that they worked on, but other related things. So, like for instance, we got to see Toy Story before it was released in '95. That was a particularly memorable one. So we were in the same room with some of these types of people, but I don't think I ever really got to know any of them. I was within spitting distance of George a few times, but I don't think I ever really talked to him about anything in particular. And I'm trying to think if there's any other notables that I would have interacted with, but no, we kept it. We were pretty much our own separate company, except for these occasional points of intersection where you like the company picnics and the Halloween parties and that kind of thing, where you get to rub elbows a little bit with them. But I'm a kind of an introvert, so I'm not the most outgoing person to go and run up to some random person to introduce myself and say, that's cool that you do ILM stuff.
Tim asks, at a previous event at California Extreme, he said, if you wanted something to be around forever, stick it in the MAME ROM set. Is that still true?
It's probably true. I don't know. I mean, there's a collector, there's a collector bug that people have. I mean, it's like with most software pirates, and there's people who are really into pirating stuff are generally collectors, and they generally want to amass as much as they can, and they generally don't use hardly any of it. They're mostly amassing things. It's just to have it. Mm-hmm. And even I was like that. I mean, I certainly pirated my share of games back in the PC Junior days, and figured out ways to put single-sided games on both sides of the floppy disk so that you could flip them over and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But I would collect more games than I would actually play. And so I think inserting data into any set of thing that is popular is good. At the time I was obviously focused on MAME, but the Scum VM sets are pretty popular. I think there's a lot of people who pass those around. I think as long as your data isn't in one spot where it can be disappeared pretty easily, mm-hmm. I think you're good. And MAME ROMs are pretty well distributed at this point, though. Again, once they added the ballooned the size of the data set, and so as the data set gets more and more unwieldy, it might be less common to have the whole set somewhere, and so maybe securing something in that might be a little more difficult. So I'd say find a modest-sized set of data that's very commonly distributed around, and put it in there, and it's probably your best bet to make sure it lives forever.
Yeah. Curtis also asks, "What do you think about OS X?" And I'll tack on to that. What do you think about it? And are you still waiting on Copeland? That's a Steve thing. Steve threw
I
that
actually
on.
tried one of the early builds of Copeland in an emulator the other day, and I'm like, man, this thing was a lot more half-baked than I remembered. But yeah, I mean, I like some stuff about OS X, but I like, I'm honestly more of a fan of the Apple hardware. Like the M1, the M chips are pretty sweet. Though I'm glad to see that it's engendering some competition in the ARM space, and that Qualcomm chips are getting caught up there. I have a laptop now, a Windows an ARM laptop, just for my own nostalgia, because I like to play with stuff that I worked on for many years. But in terms of the operating system, it annoys me in ways that are probably mostly just because I'm used to the way Windows works. And so, but every once in a while, like, I'm wrestling with things like how the maximize behavior works. So, like, if you're running in a window and you click the little green button, it maximizes, but to another space. And that behaves kind of like full screen, but it's not quite full screen. And part of that has to do with how SDL, which is the porting, basically the platform upon which I build my emulator, how it handles the behavior there. It doesn't treat maximize in that way like a full screen does. I find some of the way it handles screen scaling to be annoying, and a lot of this just has to do with, like, I'm running an emulator, and I want to know how many pixels I am actually drawing, and I don't care whether it's a Retina display or what kind of scaling the user has set. And Apple lies to the developer so hard about the scaling factors, about what it is. Like, even when I think I found a way to find the real pixel value, like the real actual thing out of there, I find that that's still wrong if I change the scale factor and the display settings. And I'm like, could you just let me know somehow how many pixels I'm drawing to? Because, like, it affects things. Like, I have a shader that stimulates a CRT display, and how it behaves. It's actually important that I know how many real pixels, not how many fake Apple pixels I have, but how many real actual pixels I'm drawing to. And I just can't get a straight answer. And so the things like that kind of annoy me. And those are all from a developer perspective. From a user perspective, I don't use it enough. It feels like a Linux. Honestly, I spent a lot of time in college using not Linux, but Unix systems. And it still has kind of like a Unixy feel to it, especially because I spent a lot of time on terminal. But I still sometimes feel like I feel like the it's just got a feel to it that kind of feels Linuxian behind. I don't know why. It's all like a lot of intangible stuff, but I just don't use it enough to really have a strong opinion and to really have come over. I think if I dedicated myself, I said I'm going to switch over and do this, I'd get used to these behaviors, and I'd be like, yeah, okay, that's just the way things are, and I'll work around it and that kind of thing. Yeah. So I have a few annoyances from the developer's point of view that I think are legit grievances. If you're on Mastodon, you've seen me gripe about them a few times.
All right, and here's one last question from Steve. Steve, you want to read your question?
Sure. So obviously you have some really cool posters and goodies and box software in the background, a lot of cool stuff from your heyday. Do you have any favorites you'd like to talk about or show off?
You sure you want to start on this?
Yeah, let's go.
I can go on.
Make him big.
All right. So there's Full Throttle poster, which you can see. Here, let me see if I can tilt it up. There you go. See my Full Throttle poster, which I have on there because that's the first poster that I was present enough for them to have my name on the bottom. Oh, so at the bottom they have the credits, and so my name is actually on there. And I actually got my name on the credits of a bunch of later posters, but that was the first one. I also just think it's kind of a cool poster. Yeah. On the other side, I have my Raiders of the Lost Ark poster, which I treasure because I bought that for $50 in 1980. God, 5, 6. I must have been really high school. So that's like an OG, not a reprint. That's a real OG poster. It's never been folded, and I'm proud to have that. I'm a huge Indiana Jones fan, at least the original stuff. So that was great. And behind me, this is my Mac User Eddie Award, which I still keep around because it is a massive piece of hardware.
Oh, yeah.
It's literally like 8 pounds, and you could really use it as a murder weapon. And I got that. So that was my I keep that around just because it's so cool looking. And then let's see, what else do I have? Oh, I have my basic computer games books. I think I mentioned these earlier. These are not my originals, but the if you've ever had these books when you were a kid and typed in the programs, they're all, these giant listings of code that you just type in, and they produce games, so they're all text-based. So that was fun. Obviously, my collection there. You got my virtual PC and Connectix stuff there, virtual game station, and my LucasArts MVP award for 1997, which you can kind of see there. It's,
cool.
Very nice.
Nice.
They liked what I was doing on the Mac stuff, so that was good. And Mappy is my favorite arcade game, so you can do that little Mappy area over there. We've got a little wind-up toy Mappy, which a friend gave me, and a little recreations there. And my fake Nixie clock. It's not a real Nixie. Yeah. They're too high maintenance for me. I found out I used to own, when I was in MAME, I would get arcade cabinets, and I'd be like, oh, I'd love to have an arcade cabinet. I found out I'm just not a hardware guy. I'm a software guy. And so, like, the maintenance, they just go to rot. And so, like, if I had real Nixies, they'd blow at some point. I'd never get them repaired. So this is a fake one that's got, like, little tiny IPS displays, and they just have, like, a font on them that display it. But it's good enough for me. I was like, it looks like a Nixie clock.
It seems like you have some Dia de los Muertos stuff back there, too.
Yeah, so there's this awesome, so I live near Seattle, and there's this awesome shop down near Pike Place Market. It's not in the market, it's across the street. Yeah, that's awesome. It's called Milagros, and they always have the coolest Mexican folk art there, and so I have a bunch of stuff from there. That's kind of my thing. But I also have a thing for skulls, like the dice tower in the middle of my skull thing there that my wife got me for our D&D sessions. So whenever I play in D&D, we'll roll the dice through the cool dice tower.
That's really cool.
That's
awesome. I got my theremin. You can see my theremin.
I was going to say, of course, the theremin. Yeah.
And my automaton. Those are my aspirational instruments that, like, you buy them and you think, oh, this would be cool, and you play with them for a few minutes, like, this is really freaking hard. I'm never going to have time to learn to play these things. They make great set pieces, but and then back here you can't see it, but I have a lute back there too, which I actually did learn to play for a little while, but that was sort of another project during COVID.
That's funny.
So I think that's most of the cool stuff back there.
Yeah, that Mac user. I'm sorry, Mac. What's the award? The Mac World Award.
The Mac user Eddie. Yeah.
Mac user Eddie. Yeah. Another developer I spoke to at one point. I guess it was like one of the first ones they gave out, and Steve Jobs happened to be in the party that he was in, and he took the award, unscrewed it just to, like, see what it was made out of, and screwed it back in. He seemed impressed by it, and when he put it back, like, to this day on the shelf, it's still a little bit unscrewed. It's just the way he left it.
Yeah, don't want to mess with it too much.
Yeah.
But, well, Aaron,
I've never taken it apart myself, but
well, I was going to ask, where can people find you online?
Oh, so you can go to aarongiles.com, which is my main site. And there's links there for all my projects. I kind of keep it relatively up to date. At the top, you'll have my active projects, and then you'll see my older projects. And on there, if you like to hear some of my stories, you probably heard most of them today, but there's links there about my past projects, and you can usually dig in, and I have my war stories about each one of them and a little description of what we did and my experiences there, and some links to some graphics and stuff. You can find Sam and Max fan art there from when I did the Sam and Max port. Some aspiring artist customer sent in with their check for the mail order, they actually drew a whole Sam and Max cartoon talking about sweeping the Mac user base with our product.
Cool.
Very cool. All right. Aaron, thank you so much for taking time out of your Sunday and spending it with us and answering a bunch of silly questions. And I had an amazing time. Typically, kind of at this point in the interview, what we do is we break into like a little short 10-minute thing that is basically just like, what are you working on? What have you gotten recently? If you've gotten like a cool new thing, cool new toy or something, and then we just wrap it up. So do you want to hang around for just a couple more minutes? And
Sure, yeah. I can hang out.
All right. Well, since you're our guest, you kind of told us about some things you were working on. So let's do that segment first. But what about tell us something like a cool new get that you've gotten recently?
Cool new what?
A cool new get, like something, a new toy.
Yeah. So yeah, I let's see. probably one of the cooler things I got is a friend of mine. I was working on doing the Roland MT32 emulation for Dream, and I wanted to be able to forward to a real MT32 device if you had one. And I found a friend of mine who said that he had one that he wasn't using, and he sent it to me. And so I was actually able to. Now I've got sitting on my desk next to me, which unfortunately you can't see because the camera's not pointing that way. But I got an MT32 sitting here live, and I can actually route the original like Monkey Island soundtrack through to it and everything like that. So that was a pretty cool get, and I didn't have to pay for it, which is also kind of nice. It was nice to do money.
Yeah, those have gotten super pricey recently. Yeah. Very nice. Javier, do you want to do like what you're working on and what you got?
Yeah, it's a combo. So where is it? I've been working on trying to make this, making more things about it. This is a little emulator, just for you to know, Aaron, that I got a little store, abitstuff.com, and I do things. And this is just a common emulator, but I just did some things to so it does Apple II. Because my thing is the Apple II. But it can emulate more things, and I've been trying to make it work with more games. And the latest one was Glider. I just added Glider into this one, so that's what I've been working on. And this is the latest that I just started. I was showing to Ron. This is going to be my newest product. It's an adapter to connect to the MacBook, the PowerBook. Sorry. So you can use the PowerBook with a USB
USB-C
USB-C
power adapter.
power.
Yeah.
So you don't need to get your power brick. So, and it's going to tell you the voltage on top. I got a bunch of these for the Apple II, and I'm going to be doing it for the PowerBook. So expect these soon.
Very cool.
So that's it.
Cool.
Very nice. Steve, what have you been working on? What do you got?
Yeah, so one thing I bought recently, which is very fitting for this discussion, is the Mac enhanced.
I had nothing to do with that. That was actually Brad Post, except the MIDI engine. They used my MIDI engine, the one that I reviewed.
Cool.
But the actual programming, I'll give you a quick story about that.
Yeah.
That code base was the worst code base to port, and I didn't have to do it, which was grateful for me. But the poor guy who got saddled with it, he is a super smart guy. And but he had to port it, and it was like all written in assembly language. Like the entire thing was assembly language, and for the PC. And so he had basically translated all the assembly language to C. And then when they did X-Wing versus TIE Fighter on the PC, they ended up using his backport to C as a starting point, because they didn't, at that point, they'd rather compile the code rather than having it all in assembly language.
Wow. That's funny. Yeah, because I obviously grew up with the Mac ports of these, and so years later, finding that them online or whatever is fun to grab. And X-Wing was one of the ones I used to play. I think we had the floppy disk version, so it's the CD-ROM version. I think, or no, we had the CD-ROM version, but I didn't have the box. Like it was like the cheapo re-release or whatever. So it was nice to have that. Way cheaper to get this than like Connectix Virtual Game Station, which is like silly bucks on eBay these days. But
how much is that going for these days?
Last what I saw was over $100 or so. I would love to just get a box and have you sign it or something fun, because that was always something I enjoyed.
Yeah.
See, I actually had a copy of Monkey Island 1 and 2 for the PC that I gotten from the company store. And I never opened them because I didn't have a PC. They just sat on my shelf. And then a few years ago, I was like, I should just sell these on eBay. I don't know how much they're going for. I got like over $400 for each one of them.
Oh,
yeah,
nice.
It was crazy because they were unopened. They were still in their shrink wrap.
That's great.
People love it.
Some I'm working on is just a video project, so you'll be seeing more stuff from me, I'm sure, whenever I get around to it.
Cool.
I'm in a similar boat. Again, this is one of the final days of Marchintosh for 2025. And so I've just been basically frantically sharing other people's stuff, trying to promote other people's work, and finish up a few videos and stuff. I have a video that'll post tomorrow that's all about the Mac Portable and about this really cool product training package. Wow. That has a lot of neat stuff in it. Like there's a VHS tape, there's some audio cassettes, there's some neat stuff, and basically it's just an exploration of this, but it's all like sort of commentary free. You can just watch it. As part of it, though, there's also encoding of the VHS tape, which covers a couple of different Apple products, covers the Mac Portable and the 2CI. And there's an audio cassette that also has additional information for people that were trying to get up to speed so you could sell and support those devices. So that video will probably drop tomorrow around 9 o'clock or so Eastern. And then in terms of gets, it's all been kind of Marcintosh stuff. I've got a big, beautiful printer that I can't move over here because it's too heavy. And I want to say thank you to Steve, who had me help me.
Yay!
Nice.
Help me get that LaserJet 5M up and running. And so I've been having a lot of fun, and a lot of people have been printing to it. So that's super cool. But it's Ethernet, which is nice. But I also have a Apple Talk. I'm sorry, I've got an image writer. I've got a card, local talk option card for my image writer too. And I've been wanting to kind of put like the physical Mac back on the shelf. So now I've been able to do that because I have picked up a couple of devices. Ryan from Everything's Broken Garage was really nice. He sent me this Dana Ether print, which unfortunately I had some problems trying to do it the way that I was wanting to do it. This is still a really great device. If you have a flat network that only has like maybe a zone on it, like you're just using the generic zone, it works perfect. If you have multiple zones, it kind of gets confused, and the application that you use to configure it just seems to get freaked out. I need to do some more troubleshooting. I'm eventually going to do a video about this. Thank you, Ryan, for sending me this. This was very nice, all the way from Newfoundland. And then talking with Ian Scott Pulpo, he was like, oh, if you're having problems with that, you should just buy this other thing. And I'm like, oh, well, tell me all about the configuration. And he goes, oh, you don't have to do anything. You just plug it in your network and it just works. And you know what? He was right. So I spent way too much money on one of these. This is a Farallon iPrint. It's basically what all it does is it has an Ethernet port on the back, and it has a phone connection on the other side, like RJ11. Because the whole idea is that you are just going to plug this in somewhere in your local talk network, and it will just bridge, and it doesn't care what's on the other side. It can be machines, printers, I don't know, your Andy Griselda, whatever. It's just gonna bridge it over, and it just worked. I plugged it in, it took 2 seconds. Everything has just been working beautifully ever since. So thank you everybody for all the help, all the recommendations, all the hardware. It's meant a lot because it's really allowed me to finally kind of enjoy the event.
Nice.
After a lot of stress. But that's really it for me. I did want to say that we'll go through and let's just do one last round of where folks can find you, starting with Aaron.
Oh, so yeah, online at aarongiles.com.
Javier?
Hubmaster, 8-bit stuff. Hubmaster on YouTube. 8bitstuff.com is my new thing, and 8bit tees for t-shirts.
Cool.
Nice.
Steve?
Mac84.net, and then Mac84 TV on YouTube.
Nice. I'm Ron from Ron's Computer Videos. You can find me at ronscompvids.com. I want to go ahead and promote our next guest. I'm not sure how the timing is going to shake out on this, but we'll make sure to do an announcement. But since this coming month, you have Easter in there, a lot of people travel and things like that. It might change the date that we do it, but we will have a second show. Consider this, please, to be our first April show, and then we'll have a later in the month April show. And our next guest is Veronica Explains, who will be here to explain this comment. That's a great theremin. But Veronica's great, so we'll have her on and we'll talk to her about some stuff too. So that's really it. So Aaron, thank you so much for spending time with us this evening. This was really informative. I love this stuff. Again, I gush but it's totally deserved, because we've had folks on and they're like, oh, I just did this thing, and it's like, no, this was a super important thing, because it touched so many people, inspired other people to have fun and be in the hobby and stuff. And I mean, JPEG View, I would not have made it through my teenage years. I'm gonna leave it at that.
I was gonna say, what were you watching on JPEG View?
Listen, those were some beautiful pictures of puppies.
Let's just say my wife and I had some discussions, and my girlfriend at the time, about like, I have to optimize the dithering on this particular image, and I'm sorry for the content of the image, but
right.
it's what people are looking at, and there's a green pixel here. There shouldn't be a green pixel.
I know. I'm doing it for the fans.
Yeah, quality control. Yeah.
Only for the fans. So anyway,
sacrifice.
Everybody, thank you so much for spending time with us tonight. And again, we'll be all back here shortly, maybe in a couple of weeks. And that's good. So anyway, everybody have a great night. Thanks so much. All right, I'm going to click end stream. We'll see if it actually does anything.
Thank you. Bye.
Who can say?